Hey everybody, great to have you here. Welcome to the Palm Beach Church midweek class as we finish off the year. We have been looking for the last couple of weeks, but I've been talking about the characteristics of Christ, or the character of Christ, and how, you know, there's so many, obviously, when you look at Jesus and you study out his time here on earth, his life, there's so many things about his character that stand out. And in every way, Jesus defines uh, the character, or certainly defines godliness for us. And so, if we, for example, were to look at, how loving Jesus was, and that part of his character, and how Jesus was loving, well, by looking at his life, he defines what a loving person is like. If we talk about compassion, he defines what a compassionate person is like. And so there's a number of things that we could certainly talk about and look at, and you can study out. I picked three that I wanted to focus on. The first one was spiritual. Jesus defines what a spiritual person is like. A spiritual person, obviously, Jesus is the Spirit. So for us to be able to imitate that, Matthew 5 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And so for us to be in tune with the Spirit as Jesus was, to be that kind of spiritual, then we need to be poor in spirit. We need to come to God with the attitude of, I am broken. My natural self is not who you want me to be. You want me to live by the Spirit. And so we got to be poor in spirit. Go to God with this dependency that on Him. The second characteristic is that of emotional. Jesus was emotional, but he defines what an emotional person is like. Because he's emotional, but he made decisions based on the will of God. So he's emotional. He felt things. He's empathetic. He could cry with those who are hurting. He could feel the pain. He cried over Jerusalem. He felt what we feel, and he could feel what others felt. He's in tune with what he felt at all times. Even as he faced the cross, that's one of the passages I looked at last week. Even as he faced the cross, he says, I'm in anguish to the point of death. Like, he felt deeply. And yet, because he's God and he has self-control, he didn't make decisions based on what he felt. He made decisions based on what was right. He made decisions based on what was God's will, what was the right thing to do. And the third characteristic I want to talk about Jesus, and we're going to look at today, Jesus was humble. Jesus was humble. We're going to start off with this passage here in Matthew 11. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." That was Matthew 11:28-30. This is Jesus describing himself. And when you read that passage, notice, how does he describe himself? He says, I am gentle and humble in heart. I always think about when we consider the things that we admire about Jesus. When you're in a crowd, or you're in a group of people, and you get try this, in a Bible talk, or when you're just with a group and sharing about Christ, or having a discipling time, ask, when we ask somebody, or when you ask people, when we talk about what is it about Jesus? What's the one thing about Jesus you want to imitate the most? And a lot of times when we talk about that, and we consider, okay, what's the one word that describes Jesus? What's the one thing that You want to imitate more than anything else. A lot of times we don't think about gentleness. Man, I want to be gentle as Jesus was gentle. I want to be humble as Jesus was humble. I think we think a lot about love. Love is something that even in the world, people, I think, they admire. But when was the last time you heard somebody describing themselves as, what are your top qualities? Well, I'm gentle and I'm humble. And I think it's, you know, it reminds us just how different are the qualities that God looks for as opposed to the qualities that man looks for. But more on that next week. Let's talk more about that next week. Gentle and humble in heart. Jesus, in the same way that Jesus defines these other characteristics, the same way he defines what spiritual looks like, the same way he defines what being emotional looks like, in that same way, he defines what it means to be humble. And I want to choose John 13 as our main passage for tonight. So if you could turn your Bibles there to John chapter 13. If you can read it with me here, we'll start in verse 1. John 13, verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not every one was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, in verse 12, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. And it's, John 13 is one of those passages. We see the length that Jesus was willing to go to prepare his disciples for what was to come, to teach his disciples, to make sure that they understood that they got this. He was about to leave this world, and they were going to be his representatives. And so he's making sure, he says, look, the things that I've done for you, what you've seen me do, how you've seen me be, that's how you now need to be. This is how you need to live. This is what you now need to do. And you can see the lengths that he's willing to go to, and how he'll humble himself and take the role of a servant so that they will get it, so that they will understand. Jesus, the humility of Jesus, and it's as we look at his life, as we look out at how he treated people, we learn that a humble person, humble people love people. Humble people love others. If we use Jesus to define what humility looks like, I would say that's one of the first things. The humble person loves others. And think about this. Think about how does humility help us to be loving and true humility. Let's go back to in Matthew how Jesus described himself: humble in heart, not just humble in action, not just I'm going to do the humble thing or acting humbly or understanding, okay, I need to be humble here because I'm with somebody that knows more than me. No, no. He's talking about he describes himself as someone who's humble in heart, in his core. In his core. Now, what does that look like? What is that person like? Well, that person loves others. And again, think about this. How does humility help us to love others? Well, because when you're humble, you consider others more than yourself. You consider their needs before your own. You consider God's will before your own when you're humble. Look at Philippians chapter 2, or I'll put it here up in the screen for you. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. In humility, value others above yourselves. Again, with this idea of I'm going to consider others greater than me. With that mindset, value others above yourselves. Not looking just for your own interest, but looking for the interest of others. The love that Jesus had for others, the love that he had for his disciples, the love he had for the lost, the love he had for others, it takes humility. It takes this kind of humility, this considering others, considering what do they need, considering, how did they get here? Considering what has gone on already in their life, and being able to see through the initial actions of people and consider them. To love like Jesus, it takes the humility of Jesus. That it takes that humility to be able to serve, to be able to meet the needs of others at your own expense. See, that's the love of Jesus. That kind of love takes humility. Humble people love others. The second thing I want to say about humility that we can learn from Jesus is that humble people are confident. Humility comes from confidence, not from a lack of a lack of confidence. Let's not mistake having low self-esteem for being humble. Okay, those are two different things. Just because you might have low self-esteem, it doesn't necessarily make you humble in heart. In fact, if Jesus is the most humble person there is, right? He's the epitome of humility. He's the one that defines humility for us, and certainly he's the most confident person there is. Look at this again, going back to John 13. Notice in verse 3 of John 13, it says Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Like he knew that. He was convinced of that. Like he was confident in who he was. He was confident in who he was before God. He was confident in where he was headed. And I think it's humility that allows us or allows somebody to be confident without being arrogant. And when you're confident in this kind of way, when you're confident and secure in what God thinks about you, when you're confident, when you're secure in who you are before God and who you are for God or to God, and yet how God sees you, when we are secure in that, then we can be humble. See, because when you're secure in that, then you don't need to carry this weight of I have to earn people's respect, become respected by God. I don't have to carry this burden of trying to impress people because God already is impressed by me. God already loves me. God already cares for me. I'm a son of God. See, when I can live in that kind of confidence, then I can be humble. It helps. Then I'm able to put the needs of others because I know mine are being met and seen by, or I'm being seen after by God. You know, when you have the level of confidence that Jesus has, you have nothing to prove. And think about that. Isn't that a lot of times what gets in the way of humility? Is this sense that I have something to prove? You know, when you're confident, as Jesus was confident, you're not as concerned about what others think about you. You know, when you're secure in who you are for God or who you are in the eyes of God, when you're secure in that, then you can focus on the needs of others. You know, many times arrogance comes. I can't speak for myself, and in my opinion, you know, I believe arrogance comes not from, or many times it comes from not being so secure in who the person is, or thinking I'm better, or thinking that you're better than others. Many times, the root of humility is insecurities. Is, you know, the root of humility many times is feeling insecure, feeling like I am not good enough. I know for me, when the insecurities get triggered, that's when the arrogance comes out. Certainly, that's what I've noticed in my life. It's when the insecurity gets triggered, and then I have this sense of this person doesn't respect me, or doesn't appreciate me, or I need to show that I'm worthy of, you know, whatever it is. And man, when all that gets triggered, that's where the arrogance comes out. But when we could be confident in our walk with God and who we are before God, when we can be secure in that and know, man, I've been adopted by God. I am walking in the light. I'm walking towards Jesus. I have the Holy Spirit guiding me and leading me. When I can walk securely, when I can have the confidence that Jesus has, then I believe I can practice a humility that Jesus practiced. Then I believe is where I can imitate the humility of Christ. Not a humility that's only put on, but a humility that comes from within. But that humility comes with confidence. Humble people love, humble people are confident. Thirdly, one thing we can learn about Jesus is humble people serve. Right? That's obvious. That we see throughout the life of Jesus. Humble people serve. Now, not everyone who serves is humble. Everyone who's humble serves, because when you're humble, you consider others, you consider their needs, and you're not as concerned about, you know, how does this make me look? You're more concerned of meeting, you know, person's needs, loving somebody. But not everyone who serves is necessarily doing it out of a heart of humility. Sometimes people serve to make themselves look good. Sometimes people serve because they think they have to. You know, some of us serve because it's a natural gift. I know I grew up in a home where my dad was very generous. My dad was very generous to others. You know, my dad had, like everyone else, a million flaws. But one thing he did well was serve. He served people. He was generous to people. So I grew up in a home where I admired that in my dad. And so for me, I could serve and I could be generous and without necessarily being humble. Because again, humility is not just something that we need to put on. Humility needs to be something that we work on from the inside out. But those, as we work on that humility and those that are humble, you'll see it in the way that they treat others, in the way that they serve. I mean, it wasn't just in John 13 where Jesus is serving. In fact, he says in Mark chapter 10 that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Serving is a fruit of putting the needs of others first. It is the fruit of putting God's will before our own. When we're humble and we continue to grow in that humility and from the inside out, I think it'll be seen by the way we care for people, by the way we serve, by the way we put their needs before our own. And lastly, humble people are blessed. Humble people are happy people. You know, when we're truly humble, because again, this kind of humility that we see in Jesus comes from a security and a confidence of who we are before God. And when we're walking in that kind of closeness to God, when we're walking with that kind of intimacy with God, when we're walking in the light in that way, we're going to be happy. Right? Matthew chapter 5, I believe we have that up here. Matthew chapter 5 says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Blessed are the meek. He says, you want to walk joyfully with God? He says, you know who does that? The meek do that. The meek. I heard somebody say meekness is strength controlled. That's what meekness is. Not feeling, it's humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. And I pray that as we look at Jesus and we look at his humility, we use his example to define what the humble person is like, what an emotional person is like, what a spiritual person is like. Next Wednesday, we'll wrap all this up as we finish off our midweek series. Great to have you here with us tonight. Hope you can make it back next Wednesday. Until then, good night. God bless.